Well, without further ado, let me welcome everyone here to a very special occasion. It's something that's come together very recently, as all of you know, because you probably found out very recently. It's an event that was decided upon after a great deal of thought and a great deal of consideration. And the reason for this is that we have today a coming together of two different, to use a quaint term, discursive communities, two very different frameworks of knowledge coming together. So today we have this extraordinary honor to host one such thought leader, but one who is truly a macro change maker, and someone who has an enormous platform inside China, whose work inside Tibet is extraordinary. He is one of the most dynamic public thinkers in Tibetan society today, inside Tibet. And he's someone, I think, to many of you, if not all of you, so familiar, probably does not need any introduction. So Khenpo Lodrö is one of the leading abbots of Lodrö, which is an extraordinary institution. This is the first time that Khenpo has been meeting with and having a conversation with our other main interlocutor today, who I'm also so excited to introduce. I've now had the real privilege, truly, to listen to Professor Richie Davidson speak on many occasions, and then we're going to have Dr. Martha Herbert from the Harvard Medical School give comments connecting the two discussions. So without a further word, I want to introduce Richie Davidson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tashi. And I'm just wondering if we can get the slides presented there, because none of the speakers will be able to see the slides. So if there's an AV person who can help us with that. But let me, before I show any slides, just express my gratitude to Tashi for organizing this event, and to Khenpo for the inspiring work that he's been doing. And as I've learned more and more about it, the extraordinary impact that it's having is becoming more clear, and it's a real honor for me to be here today to help to further this dialogue in whatever ways we can. So what Tashi asked me to do is just spend a few minutes describing how we approach this topic from a scientific perspective, and let me just situate this within the context of the work that I've been doing in my own career and life. I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training, and I've always been captivated from early on in my career with the central question of why is it that some people, in response to adversity, in response to life slings and arrows, are vulnerable and have a difficult time with coping with those challenges, whereas other people are much more resilient and have higher levels of well-being and show warm-heartedness in difficult situations. And how can we help to nudge people along this continuum to facilitate this increased well-being? And so that has been the central question, and for many years I pursued more of the adversity side of the equation, and then I had the great privilege of meeting many beings whose demeanor and whose presence exemplify these positive qualities, and who convinced me that now is the time to bring the tools of modern neuroscience to the study of qualities like kindness and compassion. And that there was no reason in principle why we couldn't approach these wholesome qualities of mind in the same way that we've approached the study of destructive emotions, which has occupied so much of Western psychology and neuroscience. So with that as a little bit of a background, what I'd like to do is spend the first few minutes talking about four major themes in modern science, which is enabling this work to go forward. And before I do that, let me just say that this work is now captivating the popular imagination. This picture was actually taken in our laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, and it was a cover story of National Geographic now about 10 years ago, and began to presage the increased popularity and recognition of the importance of this work. And this is just some other indications. The Scientific American had a cover story on the neuroscience of meditation that was authored by myself and Mathieu Ricard, who is a Tibetan Buddhist monk and also a molecular biologist. And that collaboration has been instrumental to facilitating this work going forward. And this is a picture of Mingyur Rinpoche, who is a very well-known Tibetan Lama who has been teaching in the West. And Mingyur Rinpoche was one of the first Tibetan Lamas to volunteer to be studied in our laboratory. And the findings that we gleaned from the study of Mingyur Rinpoche's brain, as well as other long-term practitioners, was really catalytic in launching this work. So let me now share with you these four themes. The first is neuroplasticity, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. And when we talk about neuroplasticity, here we're referring to the idea that the brain is shaped by experience. Most of the time, the brain is being unwittingly shaped by experience. And the invitation in this work is that we can all take more responsibility for the shaping of our brains by intentionally cultivating healthy habits of mind. And that is an insight that we're gleaning from the study of contemplative practice. The second theme is, in many ways, the parallel of neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics. And this theme is epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science of how genes are regulated. We can think of genes having little volume controls that go from low to high. And although we're all born with a fixed complement of base pairs that constitute our DNA, the extent to which different genes are expressed is dynamic and can be influenced by experience. We know from modern neuroscientific research that the way a mother interacts with her offspring can induce epigenetic changes in the brains of that offspring. Most of the time, our genes are being influenced by environmental forces around us that we have little control over. And again, the invitation here is that we can actually more intentionally shape our epigenetic profile and the expression of our genes. We published a paper very recently that was a kind of proof of concept study where we took long-term meditation practitioners and brought them into a laboratory and had them practice for an intensive day of practice. And we took blood samples before and after the 8 hours of practice, and we had a control group come in for a day of leisure, where they were sedentary for the day, they were fed the same diet. And we looked at changes in gene expression and epigenetic changes over the course of just 8 hours. And we were able to see changes in gene expression that were present in the meditators who were meditating for the 8 hours compared to the controls who were having a day of leisure in the laboratory. The third theme is this idea that we're learning more about the bidirectional pathways that connect the mind and the brain and the body. Our minds are extended. They extend into our bodies and likely beyond. And the state of our bodies can be influenced by our minds, and the state of our minds can be influenced by our bodies. And we're beginning to learn about how those pathways work. And it's through these pathways that we're beginning to understand how the cultivation of well-being may actually change peripheral biology, biology below the neck, in ways that may be consequential for physical health. And this is something that I think is going to be extraordinarily important as this work goes along, and I'll show you a couple of examples of this in a few moments. The fourth theme is the more controversial of these. It is a theme about which there is less scientific data, but nevertheless there is real hard-nosed data, and that is this theme of innate basic goodness. And what I mean by this is that each of us is born into the world with a propensity for kindness and compassion. And that if we are given the choice, we will choose warm-hearted and more altruistic interactions compared with those that are selfish. Now, it doesn't mean that the negative stuff isn't there, but it does mean that if we're given a choice, we will choose the good. Now, that may seem like a quite radical statement, and in this sense, I think that compassion and kindness very much have the status of language. Most scientists agree that we all come into the world with a biological propensity for language, but in order for that propensity to be expressed, it requires the presence of a linguistic community for its cultivation. We know from some case studies of feral children who were raised in the wild that if we are not surrounded by a normal linguistic community, that propensity will in fact not be expressed. And I think the same may be said of kindness and compassion. We all come into the world with the seeds of kindness and compassion, and it requires some nurturance for those seeds to become expressed. But what are the kinds of data that we can bring to bear on this? And here I'll show you two little video clips. These clips are shown to 6-month-old babies. So here's the first clip. Here's the second one. Now, which do you think 6-month-old babies prefer? Now, how do we know that? Well, we can ask them. Now, how do you ask a 6-month-old baby which he prefers? Well, one of the ways we can ask a 6-month-old baby is we can use infrared eye tracking to very carefully monitor its eye movements and to look at the frequency and duration of eye movements. And what we see is that when you present this kind of stimulus to 6-month-old babies, they very dramatically prefer to look at the helper compared to the hinderer. And this is not an artifact of the particular geometric forms that are used. It's been done now in a number of other ways with very different kinds of stimuli, with puppets, for example, and the same basic finding is present. And so these are the kind of data which lead us to the conviction that this idea of innate basic goodness is present from the start, and it also turns out that it's not restricted to humans. There are a number of other non-human species that show very similar kinds of effects. So let me now just give a couple of examples from the Neuroscience laboratory of how we begin to investigate the kinds of qualities that we're talking about. And we began the study of compassion by bringing these long-term practitioners into the laboratory. And one of the points that I want to make here, which we've been discussing just before, is the important distinction between empathy and compassion. There is a growing neuroscientific literature on both empathy and compassion, and when we think of empathy, we think and scientific research shows that we show changes in our brain that mimic the emotions of the individual that we are empathic with. And so if we're exhibiting empathy to a person who is in pain, we actually activate networks in our brain that are part of what we know is the pain matrix. Those networks in the brain that are pain responsive. Compassion is associated with the disposition to relieve the suffering of others, and it's not necessarily in one's best interest, if you will, to show activation in the pain matrix if someone's in pain, if the goal is to help relieve that person of their suffering. And it turns out that when this is studied in the laboratory, the kind of changes in the brain that we see with compassion is totally different than what we see with empathy. And we can talk about that a little bit more in the discussion period. But let me just very quickly go through this. In one experiment that we did with very long-term practitioners, these were practitioners who practiced an average of about 34,000 hours across their lifetime. These are professional contemplatives, if you will. And in the words of one of them, Mathieu Ricard, who was one of the participants, he said, for the sake of the experiment, what they've done is to generate a state in which love and compassion permeate the whole mind with no other considerations, reasoning, or discursive thoughts. So that's what they were doing in this experiment. This is a picture of me and Rinpoche wired up, participating in exactly this experiment. And when we look at the brain of these practitioners, what we see is something that had actually never been reported before in the human brain. And we saw the presence of these very high amplitude gamma oscillations that were exhibited when the practitioners were engaged in this type of meditation practice. On the left is a neutral period, on the right is the meditation period, and these high amplitude gamma oscillations are just not seen in an untrained brain. When we see gamma oscillations in most of us, they are present for very short periods of time. And you don't see them unfold over seconds and minutes. They are associated with synaptic plasticity in hardcore neuroscientific research. They're also associated with insight, where different elements of a percept or a concept are bound together in an integrated way, and when they're seen in an untrained brain, they're typically seen for less than 1 second, and here we see them persist. In very recent research, which I'm not going to show you a slide of, but it's published research, we've shown that these gamma oscillations are also present while the practitioner is sleeping. We've had them come to the sleep laboratory, and during deep sleep, we see evidence of these gamma oscillations persisting during deep sleep. Again, that's a phenomenon that has never been reported before. So we also bring the participants into the scanner. This is Mathieu Ricard, who is one of the participants in our research. And I'd like to point out that this picture was taken after Mathieu had been in the scanner for more than 3 hours. Most people don't look like this when they come out. They're a little more haggard. And Mathieu has been instrumental in facilitating this work because of his unusual credentials in both the world of Tibetan Buddhism and in the world of science. So one of the ways in which this work has been extended is by asking about whether these the same or similar changes can be observed in individuals who've never meditated before. And this is a study that I'll just very, very briefly tell you about. It was published a few years ago, where we took meditation-naive participants and we randomly assigned them to one of two groups, one of which learned a compassion meditation practice, and the other group was taught a strategy derived from from cognitive therapy to cultivate well-being. And we measured changes in the brain before and after. They went through 2 weeks of training. We also obtained a measure of pro-social or altruistic behavior from an economic decision-making task. And the training was done for 2 weeks. It was 30 minutes a day, and the training was actually delivered over the internet, which has its pros and cons, but we knew what the participants were doing and how much they were practicing. So what we saw is that after 2 weeks of training, the compassion group in green showed a higher level of altruistic or pro-social behavior on an economic decision-making task. It would take too long to go through the details of this task, but the really striking thing is that after just a short amount of practice, this is 7 hours of practice, we see a robust difference in behavior between these groups, and also a robust change in the brain that was associated with these changes in behavior after just 7 hours of practice, suggesting that it doesn't actually take much to activate what may be an innate propensity and show changes in the brain and behavior. By showing these changes, we don't assume that they're going to endure without continued practice, but what they do show is we can see these changes very early on in the process of this kind of mind training. Now, I talked about these bidirectional highways between the brain and the body. And one of the ways that we've explored this is by looking at parameters of immune function. And in one of our very early studies, we gave people who were taught an 8-week program of mindfulness meditation and a control group a flu shot at the end of this 8 weeks of training. And we compared the two groups. And we measured the antibody titers mounted in response to the vaccine by simply taking blood samples before and after the vaccine was administered. And what you see here is the meditators in red and the controls in blue. After just 8 weeks of training, the meditators are showing a boost in their immune response, a boost in the magnitude with which the antibody titers are mounted in response to the vaccine, indicating that the vaccine is more effective in this group. Inflammation is a big issue in many chronic illnesses, and there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that certain kinds of contemplative practices may have anti-inflammatory effects. And I won't go into the details here other than to say that we have developed procedures in the laboratory for inducing experimentally an inflammatory response. We can do it very safely, locally. One of the ways that we do this is to simply use a cream that has as its active agent capsaicin, which is derived from chili peppers, which causes a local inflammation. We can do it on the arm, and we can look at the rate at which that inflammation resolves or heals. These are just photographs of doing that. The circles are small, tiny little blisters that we create with a vacuum system that allows us to extract the blister fluid and look at some of the molecular markers, which are important in producing the healing in this case. And what we've observed is that there are pro-inflammatory cytokines that are altered by 8 weeks of meditation, and there is also a corresponding change in the rate at which these inflammatory responses resolve. And so the healing occurs more quickly as a consequence of this kind of practice. And let me just end by saying that we're actively trying to take the insights that we glean from this work in the laboratory and bring them out into the world. And we have developed a simple mindfulness-based kindness curriculum for preschool children, for 5-year-olds, because we know that the period between 5 and 7 is a period of essentially a period of brain development. We know the brain is undergoing massive changes during that period. This is a period when we know, for example, that it's much easier to learn a second language, much easier to learn to play a musical instrument, and we would contend likely much easier to nurture kindness and compassion as well. And so if we can intervene at this age, teaching kids simple skills to cultivate these qualities, can we produce enduring changes that may affect a child's developmental trajectory? And so we're beginning to do this work in public schools with randomized controlled trials. And the very first scientific paper, which this is a shot of, has just recently come out, showing the value of this kind of mindfulness-based kindness curriculum in 5-year-olds. And so we envision that this will help to usher in the more widespread incorporation of these simple secular practices in major institutions of our culture, including education, as well as the workplace and healthcare, as 3 major institutions that we envision impacting. So I'm going to end there, and again, I want to thank Tashi and Khenpo for their kind invitation to participate today.
Good afternoon to everyone.
I don't think that's
So the research that Professor Ritchie has been undertaking has a great connection, a very close relationship to Buddhism, and so I would like to talk about this research this afternoon from the perspective of Buddhism. So the relationship between the mind and the brain, compassion and mindfulness, these are all major subjects of Buddhism. So now that science has begun to research these things and has actually made a lot of progress and has produced very good results, I would like this afternoon to talk a little bit about how Buddhism sees this. So science mainly investigates the brain or explains things in terms of the brain. Buddhism, on the other hand, explains things in terms of the mind. So even though the subjects that they research are different, in many respects there are many common aspects of the path that they pursue and many findings that they have in common. So, for example, Professor Ritchie has done research into people playing the piano and moving their fingers. It has been found that by physically moving one's fingers in playing the piano or practicing playing the piano, that this affects change in a particular part of the brain. At the same time, it has also been found that by meditating on playing the piano, that is, by visualizing oneself playing the piano, that it is also possible for the brain to be influenced in a very similar way. So for very similar processes to take place in one situation where the fingers are physically moving and in one situation where the fingers moving is only being visualized. So this is one conclusion that has been reached.
Teni te jambada manda chile te shetang aso teni liga teni lapa na kangpa na teni lipo gerke kangshina ti lapa la gerwa te tongu yina teni sen jamba teni tanga so lipo yang cha jiji ya mare kha yang jiji ya mare na sen chipo gum yarni teni lapa la gerwa tongu yo te teni aso namba teni nala teni dela hali pa yo genzere namba da chabar da aso sanga nala teni dikor dela teni de la teni teni paso leka mambos le gum jarne leka mambos le yore.
So this latter finding in particular is quite extraordinary. In general, that moving, particularly physically moving parts of the body, has an effect on the brain is one thing, but just through the power of the mind simulating a particular action, that this could have an effect on the brain without any part of our body moving or without our saying anything, that this would in itself be capable of affecting change on the mind is a finding that has a lot of proximity with Buddhist concerns, and particularly with Tantric Buddhism.
Teni ti toni ngaso gare hago yo zena teni ngaso sim dela nipa pe nipa teni chimbo yo patro sim chipo la teni sim ga nipa la teni ngaso teni la pala gela chimbo tan to yo ba teni ti toni chongo yo re.
So the main finding that we really have to draw from this is that the mind has great power, and just through the power of the mind it is capable to make changes at the level of the brain.
Teni namchu ta dinani khabar de bog de sanga de doji ta pa no de yena teni khotso samno na gari zena ngacho mi teni lipotela ngacho mukun thong thapi tini wangsa teni yore te ngacho ta ti chama de ha ko yare so are pa thone ya mambo ha ko re te teni yang ngacho lipo nala mukun thong ma tha pa teni wangsa o teni mambo teni yore te na pe na ngacho la pa nala teni wangsa teni zu karchi shu teni simchu so ni yoze teni so res.
So in Buddhism, and particularly in the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition, it is held that in addition to the nerves nerves that we have in our body, that is, we have ones that are visible, ones that are able to be seen, and these are the kind that are now researched and known about by medicine. But in addition to these, we also have invisible nerves or invisible channels. And the way that the Tibetan tradition explains is that we have 32 main nerve channels.
Teni te mai ba ga muk teni zila ta ya ta nawa ga jala nya ya ta teni lapa ga teni raksha pa te su sama ga tsawa te teni khorang ga teni tsawa de na so wangsa te so lapa na na yo ti wangsa te so domna teni wangsa ngap ja yo se te so ris.
So in addition to these main 32 nerves or channels, with all of the different nerves that are associated with our sense faculties, with our sight, our smell, our capacity to touch, etc., it is held that there are in total 500 different nerve channels that come together in the brain.
Teni tsamo tsawa nanga hani pa chimbo teni wangsa mambo na so lapa na la yoti teni doji tampa gum yarni gum gni pa la teni khotso lapa na ni sa ti so la teni gerwa ta de ore.
So with so many nerve channels coming together in the brain, in Vajrayana, it is held that but through meditation, it is possible to effect change on these nerves.
Teni lapa la ngira tamba matsa teni kharanga teni lipo tsangmala teni dito teni ngira tangni teni pena gomya pojam kanga teni makashi teni shevi teni jina teni pena kharanga lipo tingola pena teni mochi tangkarma danchinda o teni danchi gache na teni mo chimbo yinkan so yina teni chong reni zhaganda bu ma to mepa teni mampo zata ga so musi yong de yori di natu za na o teni na la yo teni goni. So,
in addition to being able to effect change on the nerves in this way, it's also possible through meditation for changes in these channels to manifest in changes in the physical body. So, for example, a person originally of 1.7 meters in height, after they die, it is possible through meditating and effecting changes on these channels for them to shrink to a size no greater than a forearm's length. So that just through the power of meditation alone is able to change the mind or effect change on the mind is something that Buddhism and science now probably have a similar viewpoint on.
Also Zahnke da schon der Ding also da mucken Tunga yupi wansa telam jiwa ko yores teni gum jam kan da sang doji thapa teni mucken Tunga yupa tela jiwa tangare daru khabarta teni muk mantu idini libo wansa tesolam jiwa chimbo tangayore.
However, there is still one major difference, and that is primarily that science researches those brain processes or nerves, that the nervous system that we are able to observe, that is that which is visible, whereas Buddhism is concerned with, or primarily concerned with, that nerve system which is not visible or perceivable to the naked eye.
Tani ngaso jitin ka khamda tani ngaso upo ni ga trap ko duse jitin ngaso mukun thoya yo pa ga tani tani upo te jacha nga cha ma pa zong yo mares jitin ngaso muk mang thowa te jacha gu chu go tu zong yo re te sure ko tani jitin ka khamda tani res ki ko tani te tang ra po ngaso lipo yin na tani ngaso mukun thoya ga tani upo chi da tani muk mang thowa upo tani ni ka ga tani mi lipo da trap du.
So just as in terms as the external material universe is comprised of material or matter that we can see and also a great deal of matter that we can't see. It's said, for example, that 5% of the matter of the universe we are able to see, whereas the great majority, 90% or more, is dark matter, is not able to be seen by us. The same goes for our bodies as well. So our bodies are comprised of a material component that is able to be seen or perceived and components that are not.
Tani ngaso simba nala pena tarik gona tani gegeri chira ga tani song se ngaso pena simba nala sham nyang ji gombi ne kumna tani laba nala tani gela do yore tenda bozu pena ngarang da tani rewa yo sa ga pena ngarang ga tani chongpong da tani ngarang ga khyamsang ga minda tindi la tani dumur yona tani ngarang da tani ngarang ga laba nala tani gela tani do yo se khong do song se tani ngaso nang chu ya tani ze ga yore tela tani te ze ga yore yena nang chu ka ni ze ga yore zina tani pe jana ngaso tani chego gola tani nya rona tani chego gola nya rona pe na chego tang la rona ko ma chego te ze khala tani nang la tani nya tani rona tani chego thola tani barlo ze gona chego thola tani chego yo re ze chela yo gar te kres tani ti kapsa ngaso mukatana tani thola chego tani yo ra ti yo gar te re ina ola yo nya ti ngaso ta ro thak ko mare ze Tinti inti ngaso perna tsari ka toni ngaso lapa la teni deshi mambo teni jab lapa la jira do yuwa te kaang rezi na perna chir teni yuwa da ore zi chir yuwa da ore Yena ti ola tarong upo yakchi yore, te karesina ngacho simre, simte korang chilo nanda nyanja pore, tendi yendi tarong simte unitani gadis ginta mayin te tacho tarong shita kuya mares.
So, just as Professor Ritchie was speaking about before, the relationship between the mind and compassion, the capacity for the cultivation of compassion to effect change on the brain at the same time, the capacity for us to feel a similar feeling of suffering or to feel an empathetic feeling of suffering when our friends or family members encounter suffering. These findings, in fact, Buddhism looks upon them in a very similar way. The way that Buddhism would describe it is rather like a fish swimming underneath the surface of the water. So whilst we might not be able to see the fish, we can still see the signs of the fish, the water rippling, the water moving. But this rippling on the surface of the water is the sign of a fish. It's not actually the fish. And so then we could say then that the way that science has been researching the different brain processes is similar to looking at the ripples on the surface of the water. However, underneath these ripples is something more. And what this something more is our mind, like a fish. However, really, as to the nature of what this mind is, this is something that we're not yet able to understand.
Teni tsangki na so de deni ta chigola nyangu ne ku kutini tongla deni chila kula yorba ka di do du korang de gandi yong do teni tsangki so de la ta du se facha teni nga so nang chu na so ola yo bi nya de gandi de du se de la ta du se ka ta ni ka ya deni vera pe zambu yore.
So we could say that science, in looking at the changes that take place in the brain through different machines, is similar to looking at the changes on the surface of the water that are produced by the fish. The Buddhist approach is rather to look at the nature of the fish. In any case, there is a great connection between these two approaches.
Teni kangatoni reshi jamna teni thati teni ngaso pachi chikpa da ore ngadu se kaure sena ngaso chila teni yowa yowa tam teni chila thola teni yowa ti gemsen te kaure sena te ola nyayo bi gemsen jiri teni nya mena chila yowa teni yoga mares teni chila yowa teni ola teni nya bi yo nya khorang teni rodula teni ta teni chila yowa yongore teni ra bozuk pe na ngaso de That's all about the Yamamodo Jimson, they call a single Namtok Damada Jimson Jidis. Then he single Namtok Pena, Shamdan Jindao, the Dimambo, Damada Mamboyona, then you Lapala Jerago, then you parla, counter the Pala, Vera Halibatamboris.
So ultimately, it would seem that the approaches converge into one. The reason that we can observe changes in the brain is because, or observe changes on the surface of the water, is because of the existence of fish. Without the fish existing or swimming under the water, there would be no changes to observe on its surface. And it's through the movements of the fish beneath the water that produces the signs on the surface of the water. So compassion, cultivating compassion can have an effect on the brain, and that the brain change is related to the mind. There is a great connection ultimately between these two approaches.
Lapa te kandis na pena mi pesho ta cincha ta was redus cincha da bores tani semte kandis na pena ngaram cincha koshet jamgang mo ngaram da bores o te indi tani lapa de ngaso tani simga korang lacha da bore tani lapa tani leka andiri sem korang tani leka mambole gona tani lapa la tani leka de lego ne ma to lapa la matina leka le te ma perna ngarang tani Simple Tony Leka Mamboli Bonan, the Yona, Letham Kurmato, the Mena, Maranga Letham Kumari, Tindi, Simple thing also the Lapa thing also Simple Dapore, Namshi, Shipating also Mutapore, isn't it? Didn't announce you, did you go in the Japore?
So the Buddhist explanation would be that the brain is like a computer and that the mind is like the operator of a computer. So therefore the mind is like a tool of the brain, is like a tool of the mind. The mind relies on the brain in order to do things. Without the brain, it wouldn't be able to do any of the things that it does. So it needs the brain in order to accomplish the tasks it needs to do.
Teni ngacho nangba wangde shina karis gerzenda teni ngacho laba yang teni simla chunjung she geres chunjung she kzawani marizena mari de chunjung she geres pena ngarang la chingchen de mena teni khorang de teni ngarang la teni lekka leya la de chunjung she geres pena khorang yona ngarang dumjum mungal ne di thola lekka le geres khorang ka teni mena teni ngarang de ki ma to yo mari de da pore teni kendi ngacho laba yang teni shetang simla teni chunjung she geres.
So traditional science explains the brain as controlling the mind, and Buddhism, to some extent, also sees this as the case. For example, without a computer, it wouldn't be possible for me to do this task. It's the existence of the computer that facilitates me moving my fingers in the way that I am and completing the tasks in the way that I am. From Buddhism's point of view, too, it also acknowledges the impact or the influence of the brain on the mind.
옛날에 되니 진천 이 나라라 셔당 천천 시그리다 이 나라라 천천 침부시 듣고 말이야. 내 진천 그 돌아내까 말에 나라랑 내가 잠발에 쳐거리. 대당 잡고 난 나서 라바 되니 나서 되니 라바 되니 대탕메나 되니 삼로 단서리 대추 걸라 되니 시킨 대거리. 되니 인디 라바가 나서 셈라 천천 시시 그래서 옛날에 되니 천천 할리바 침부시 듣고 말해.
So even though our brain does have an effect, it does influence our mind, it is not as great in extent as is the case vice versa. It is possible for us, for example, to choose to do something different than the task that we are immediately doing. Clearly, if our brains are unhealthy, that this has an effect on our mind. So, of course, the brain does have some influence on our mind. However, it is not great in extent.
Then semgo teni labala teni chonjol dele ton chembo she karezi teni semgo teni chonjol haliba chembo she kare teni semgo teni gom jabala teni labala jerwa haliba pe chembo tangare.
By comparison, the influence of the mind on the brain is much greater. So through the power of meditation, it's possible for the mind to exert a great influence on the brain.
Then the nacho teni labala shoni jimji nanda semgo shoni jimji nanda gangta. Then the same gotola the market by one daughter, then it dumble one daughter, it's what I'm just put a new mumba mepa chit, then it's hard to jim and also now to jim and the summer muyiti teres.
Regardless of whether our research approach is a Buddhist one or is or looking at the mind or the scientific approach, ultimately the goal of the mind in a state of unhappiness or suffering or experience afflictive emotions, there is a common goal of reducing or eliminating these states of suffering.
Then in German, I think now the Japanese Yoina, there are things that are in the Tardushi, the Yapozra Masons. Then I also need to Changa, Lola, the Lumjigla, the Lama, the also Setala, the Indesons, the Casri Korami, Komochimbo, the Korantini Mushita, Karma, Jash, the Riosa, the Muchimbore. Then he Korandini, then he Jama Dumchak, the Dumchak Gila. Teni koranga teni lipo jecho sone teni pera nga tsu chakang rawo teni mepa teni chandu te nga tsu ngosen samare te zan rawo ta teni tsawani mares.
So I did have some photos that I wanted to show you that showed showing the connection between meditation and the body, but unfortunately I don't have them to show you here today. What these photos were about was in 2015, last year, in Seda County, there was a Lama who passed away. He was a big man, and within a period of a week, his body shrunk from its former size to a very small size, only the length of one forearm.
De lama so de ni lipo che chong do de ngoma mari zambare de ni me de ni lapa de ni chat thong thong shi kamba chat ni thong thong shi de ri she ke yo re ne de ni la yo re da de za ni mare nga chu pe na lama de ni de so na de ni lama ko dong de de la nga chu so ma chu ye na ha ke da wo de ni za re de ni ha ke da wo tsna de ni lama de ni ko dong a ra chu pe na zo sha da bo pa sha da bo shi ni de ni chat ni de ni de za ni de she mare.
So this case in question is one that really and truly took place. Some people raising doubts on the internet said that the people around the Lama took bits and pieces of his body and cobbled them together into this very small size, and that it was fake, that it was fabricated. But this is clearly not the case. The students of a Lama regard the body of their deceased teacher as extremely sacred, and they regard it with much reverence and respect, and would in no way think to mash it together like you would yak meat or pork.
Gungkare namji nga so namkhalan jashar ke mare teni namkha thamji pun ja teni chawani nga so rugmam wa tin jare te nga teni ngama teni di nga so shatan namji ni na ru chawani mamnyu wa teni ja mo boda teni parang lipo sama teni rakti teni chongchong teni jesons.
And then there was another instance at the end of 2015, at the end of last year, there was another Lama, and he passed away in winter. In winter, we don't often see rainbows. However, at the time of his passing, extraordinary rainbows were manifested in the sky. And when his, after the... Yeah, and his body ultimately transformed into many sacred particles or relics. And I have photos of all of these things. These are things that really and truly took place. They're not made up at all. However, lots of people say that they're fakery and forgery and don't believe it. And until this present day, these are phenomena that science is not yet able to explain. However, I do think in the future that Western science will be able to explain these phenomena, and if so, would welcome this very much. And I would just like to say thank you to Professor Ritchie and Jashi and everybody else who has come here today. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarkable, interesting and complimentary comments. I'll keep my comments here brief. In Ritchie's talk, as a neuroscientist myself and someone who works in EEG, the single thing that most impressed me was that remarkable finding of the persistent gamma in the EEG of the practitioner who was practicing compassion, showing that the mind can change the brain right there on the tracing. When I hear Khenpo talking about the many more channels in
the nerve channels in the body and the brain compared to what Western science might describe, I would like to point out that in the last few decades there's been a remarkable revolution and broadening of the scope of interest beyond nerves and nerve channels, going into glial cells, astrocytes, in their roles in signaling, and not just in housekeeping. And now also to the fluids of the brain, the extracellular matrix, the extracellular space, which are found now to be really important modulators of neural signaling, and also the connective tissue with its amazing electrical connectivity properties throughout the body, which have been shown to be quite relevant in what happens in acupuncture treatments, among other things. So what we have is an expansion of scope on the Western side, and yet still we're doing, I think, more descriptive science than we are generative science when we measure all these things. A long time ago, I wrote an article talking about all the brain imaging research. In my center, I worked at the Martino Center in Charlestown in meditation research, and acupuncture research, but I felt that our activities would not have generated these practices, and that these practices were generated by a much deeper kind of discipline than what is characteristic of our culture here in our training. So that, and I feel also concerned that our culture, by generating these activities without a core of compassion, can do some quite remarkable transformations of nature that maybe are not so good. And I say this in particular from my work as a pediatric neurologist, where I treat a lot of children who have really disturbed mental processes, particularly autism, and very much think that this is deeply rooted in environmental changes arising to a great degree from a disconnect between our technical capabilities and our compassion. So, in a way, we need to marshal this capacity for compassion, to marshal the energetic capacities of the remarkable oscillating liquid crystal brain that we have, to perhaps generate a kind of capability that can reverse the quite alarming degradation of the physical underpinnings, both of our brain capabilities and of our capacity to support life on the planet. And I really hope that the quality of the research and the dialogue will marry not only the science, but our responsiveness and responsibility and ability to respond in an upgrading way, the way that I think that the meditative practice upgrades the brain. So thank you.
Thank you all for being here. This is really a unique conversation to witness. I'm very curious. This is mostly a question for Dr. Davidson or maybe Dr. Herbert as well. I've also been puzzled too about how a neuroscience study, whether it's a proof of concept study or what have you, could garner evidence for the types of channels that Khenpo was talking about, especially the invisible channels. And what, as neuroscientists, do you look for as evidence for the existence of those channels? So what kind of criteria would you bring to evaluate studies that would try to evaluate whether or not those channels actually existed?
Well, I can say something about it, and then I'm sure Martha will have something interesting to say about this too. I think it's important to recognize that although we the capital we have made progress in neuroscience, we need to remind ourselves continuously of how much we actually don't know, and to really practice humility in the face of not knowing. And I think that one byproduct of these dialogues has been I think, cultivating more humility in the face of the extraordinary tradition that Khenpo represents and the insights that have been gleaned in a very different way of investigating the mind. It's very easy for us as scientists to have a very knee-jerk reaction to these ideas, and yet I think that the more truthful response is one of not knowing, and being able to rest in that place of humility and of not knowing and of openness. And in terms of these additional channels, and there's this extraordinarily detailed understanding of the subtle body in Vajrayana Buddhism that we have absolutely no idea about from a conventional modern scientific perspective. But I think that that's okay. I mean, we can just rest with the ambiguity of not knowing and not prematurely dismiss it and not necessarily enthusiastically embrace it. I think that we can simply rest in that place of not knowing. Just very recently, scientists have discovered new immune receptors in the brain that we didn't know existed before. And so there's just continuous change in our understanding. And so I think that we need to be patient. That's something that's a quality that is important in both Buddhism and in science. It's hard to predict. But, it's also the case that a lot of the things that scientists tinker with these days are things that were 10 years ago completely invisible. Absolutely invisible. We couldn't see them. We didn't know they existed. And now we have ways of actually seeing them. And so I think that we just need to approach this with openness and with some humility about what we don't know.
I'll say one quick thing. I just want to add one term of art. By the way, there have been two remarkable discoveries also in the brain about fluid passages. Mark and Niedergaard from Rochester was at MIT last week. We didn't know that there were these lymphatic passages in the dura and glial rivers in the brain at night when you sleep, but not in the daytime. But I just wanted to say that a term of art that should be used a lot more in science is to the limits of our ability to detect. A kind of humility.
I also want to thank you for a very, very interesting conversation, and really to follow up on the question, because the whole issue of what's observable or not, and because Khenpo is claiming that the mind leads the way, and the mind is the real mover, and the physical reality is that which responds or maybe is somehow even created by the mind. On the one hand, I would want to ask Khenpo whether, for example, as you mentioned, the subtle body, is it the case that the subtle body is entirely not physical? Is it important that it's not observable empirically? Is there something about its very nature that makes it important for it not to be observable? So that's one question. And then from the other perspective, I do think it's, even though we're humble, it's important to maybe start to think about ways of conceptualizing the notion of channels or pathways or connections that is not necessarily physical. Just to give one example, if you're talking about the mind, when we have a thought, and then that thought leads to or connects to another thought, does that have a physical analog at all? Or, might it be the case that there are hard, from our life's history, we have these connections. I always associate something with something else. Is that entirely non-physical, or what's the nature of that connection? So I'm just trying to push both of you further.
Teni jen teni chu tambo se ta teni chikra teni wang sa ma lu teni tu ke te la ji yore teni na so teni che sa so lu pe na so lu pe cha shi ji na so lu tu ta ke shi ya teni na so tom tu bi teni lu po te la rapi jucha chi ha yu ma ba teni na so teni rapi teni mu bu ko chu chi ne na teni mu bu ko chu chi ya me bi kin sa chi le
teni parchete torturing ni sa ba ne na so shetang na so lapa na la teni tsasum so ni yo si te wang tsasum so ni sim so ni te chama na mu bu thong ma ta ba ta da re shetang simsoni tsaka marta zo de ina shirko ngupo mare zega marte ngupo rezi ina nga zo ngupo de la mambo zuduzi ngupo kashi nga zo ngupo tongo yore ngupo kashi nga zo dawa nawa teni tongo yore ngupo kashi nga zo teni shichi ga tongo yore ngupo la mambo ndu de di shetang de ngupo rezi grezi ina pe na nga zo wolla rawa wolla teni nga zo ngupo mambo ot pe na teni X-quang or X-wood data yore or data the readers in Martha Pena data for any Upodilla Mambo Shetan Upo Maris and Marion Oposaris.
So just in relation to the first question there, Khenpo said that in relation to the 32 main channels or nerve channels in the body that come together in the mind, in saying that we can't see them, it's true that we can't see them, we can't perceive them with our eyes. However, this is not saying that they aren't matter or that they aren't a kind of matter. We can distinguish matter into different types. For example, there are some kinds of matter or some material that we can only see, or other kinds that we can only hear, or other kinds that we can only taste. So an X-ray is an example of light that exists, but we are not able to perceive with our eyes. So in terms of the nerve channels in our body, it's true that we can't see them, but this doesn't mean that they are not material.
Tene ka so mugum thong matavna te yobati kang ka shigresina tene gum jamne tene gum ko thone tene te nga so ti lipo laba no la tinji warsa yo ate peshat tansar ka tene gum ko tene tapshi zindu ti tapshi te la tena tene khora yobata ha ko re.
So if we can't see them with our eyes, then how do we know that they exist, or how can we know that they exist? The method that we use is to rely on meditation methods in the Vajrayana tradition, and by applying these methods, it is possible for us to use these nerve channels, and by doing this, it's possible for us to know experientially that they exist.
Teni gum jamkan ka teni khorang ka lipo nala yupi teni alung te so teni ta lipo teni nala mambo teni par teni khorchup shini teni ndore pena nga so tarta yana nga so long te teni kharna na ne parton sartong da lowa ga parton ro ma to ba yo mare ti khorang so teni lung ka namjur nyamlim shitam kan so teni lung te teni lipo chama na landro teni lapa na landro ti teni rosa teni mambo yo pate te khoso nyamnyu ko yo res.
So in terms of winds in our body and their circulation, in general, our breath, we are only really aware of it in terms of the breath that we breathe in and out, and air or breath coming in through our mouth and coming out through our lungs. However, for a practitioner who is trained in this kind of meditation, then the circulation of wind or breath throughout their entire body is something that they are experientially able to be aware of.
So, with regard to the second question, Janet, on thought, there's a lot of neuroscientific data now on that question, and I think that most cognitive neuroscientists would agree that thoughts are accompanied by specific patterns of neural activity, and some neuroscientists would go so far as to say that, at least for particular classes of thoughts, you can use the neural activity to make the reverse inference about the class of thought that is being generated in the mind based on the observation of the neural activity, and that you could make a prediction about what class of thought is being generated and be reasonably accurate in that prediction based on the pattern of neural activity. Again, it skirts the issue of what is the causal agent here, most mainstream neuroscientists would not even consider that to be a question. But in this context, it certainly, I think, is an important question, and we can put it on the table. But the kinds of experiments that have been done don't permit the causal dissection, if you will. They're simply correlational.
I have a question. I was just wondering if you could give Western scientists some advice on how to study the fish instead of just studying the ripples of the water.
Good question.
That's to you, yeah?
No, it's to Khenpo.
Khenpo.
It's asking for Khenpo's advice.
Khenpo said that it's very difficult for him to give any advice to Western scientists on this.
차르 빠지야데 코랑라 차르 따와요 빠지리 근데 인디 코랑 그 차르 고네 잠발랑라 지텐라 타고 그래.
So scientists, they embrace or hold the scientific viewpoint, and so the way that they need to go about investigating phenomena is in accordance with this.
Teni koran ko teni sem ko teni namgerte 문에다니 차르당 탐바지긴 고요레스. 코랑 거 따따 코랑 거 따따 코랑 거 다리 타이도 코랑 거 남겨대 teni 차르당 탐바지긴 고요레스.
And so the approach that they take needs to be in accordance with science.
강스당 라바짱바라 teni 더 짐직신이 도나 맞춰 남바스 근군이 따나 람람본도야 만두지.
However, just looking at the brain or researching the processes of the brain from a Buddhist point of view doesn't have a particularly, or doesn't promise a particularly long path of research. However, there is some scope to, or some distance to traverse along this path, and that distance that does exist is one that is currently being travelled by Professor Ritchie. However, beyond this, probably there isn't too far to travel.
Yena nyimasigla tini lam tindo sa mepa shitari jine nge samotana la jankaz lamka jambaz tini tsaruk pazigin tsarti tini korang chor kores samgundus terang ngatsong la ichios.
However, what I do believe is that when scientists reach the end of this path, then they will inevitably look for another path to pursue.
Tini kewa ngapshi go jimjikta tini simkam go tini sim go tini jimjikti so yena Taftada yena nafshoko tani tsaruk patsawo tela halipa tani chu tondang tani titola jimjikta yana tsaruk pa mambozi ka chu samlo ke yang bonda o sheni tani shega manduzi yena nyimachila teso kotso tani denhwa yo pa tani zgendi tang arang so te zamba rize handa o te nora rize handa o tani tsini poto refshen mambo japtab kumare tani yendi nyimachila ne samlo tangna macho lafsha jab go kumare kotso So in
terms of phenomena like past and future lives and the nature of the mind, These are things that many Western scientists still are not prepared to approach or research in an open-minded way. However, one day when there does exist some evidence for this, then it won't be possible to dismiss these phenomena in simply saying that they're fake or untrue. So I don't think it's actually necessary to impart any advice to Western scientists. I have conviction that when the time comes that they will naturally embark on this course of research.
I just want to add a few comments here about the problem of subjectivity for Western science, where our objectivity is considered to be something that should not be contaminated by our subjectivity. But here what we have is not contamination, but intense discipline, and discipline in a culture of discipline where consistent patterns are being observed by people who carry out those disciplines. And then are being taken seriously because of that. And I personally think, and there have been traditions in the West, like there's a phenomenologist in the Dutch phenomenologist Buitendiek, who wrote a book, The Physiology of the Living Body, implying that that's a kind of thing that could be discipline. But I really think the science that we have not yet seen would be carried out by people who have both carried out that kind of discipline and learned instrumentation and measurement and scientific techniques, and we don't have that really right now.
I don't know which this one came first, I think, and then this one over here.
So I was very interested to hear about the campaign for a vegetarian diet in Tibet and in China. I mean, I think it's definitely the way to go. I mean, I think it's the only way our societies can flourish and our planet can survive, and not to speak of the well-being of animals. So I would like to know more about the campaign and the thinking behind it.
Oh yeah. Ngatu janaka nala ngatu kaze berke omari janaka nan chu nyamlin shinken so nala kaze trodin haliba yapo yore te berke omaris.
So first of all, we haven't been promoting vegetarianism in China independently, so to speak. Among Chinese Buddhists or practitioners of Chinese Buddhism in China, there is a very long and flourishing tradition of vegetarianism. And so the community among which we've really been promoting vegetarianism is in Tibet, and in Tibet specifically among ordained members of the community. Among the lay community, aside from encouraging vegetarianism, saying that it's a positive thing, we haven't laid out a clear creed or made stipulations in this way.
Kashi yore ji kori chung chung da oda so kola yore da jim chung zo di ni re jideng so simjin ga dine stokla dane chung chung ya boshi ya di do da res jide dane ni de ngaran so so rang ga dine sham da nyang ji ya ji den ro ya de la karzi da ni kala nge wa hale pa chimbo yo pa ga so san ji ga dine jong da na la song yore dane ngusung chwa ga na ne ya de Halipa Chamartin Chimbo Yopati Go to Hindi Shamdanya Giargi Yoma Zoti, Jimson Tini de la Tini, Garzi Pergores.
And the reasons for promoting vegetarianism are primarily twofold. Of course, it's possible to talk about many positive advantages of vegetarianism, such as benefits for the environment and so on. However, my reasons for promoting vegetarianism are primarily twofold. The first being the protection of life, the protection of living beings' lives. That's the first goal or reason. And the second goal or reason is to enhance the development of compassion. So vegetarianism, there's a strong or close connection between vegetarianism and the cultivation of compassion. This is something that's spoken of in Buddhist scriptures and something as well that we and I have experiential experience of.
Yeah, good to see you.
The kind of state of the art. Has contemplative neuroscience taught us anything new that we didn't, or that Buddhism already didn't know about meditation or spiritual practice? Or has it falsified anything we thought we did know? So the state of the art. Progress has been made. Or is it just, as Martin said, so far descriptive?
Yeah, well, that's an important question, and it's difficult in 3 minutes to sort of summarize all that's been done in contemplative neuroscience. There are a few things to say about it. I would say that it has in many ways largely been descriptive, although there are important things that I think we have discovered and things that we thought we would find that we haven't found. So I'll give you just a few examples, and they range in their importance. And these are examples that are just recent findings or non-findings. And so one is simply changes in brain structure. No one really thought that we would necessarily be able to see these kinds of changes, even though from modern neuroscience, logically, we might expect to see these kinds of changes. And the kinds of changes that have been observed are kind of interesting. And we're still very early on. I think there are a lot of these findings that won't replicate, and we'll have to see how this all unfolds. But there's a recent report from a group at UCLA where they used a number of metrics to characterize the overall aging of the brain in relation to chronological age. And one of the things that they observed is that among long-term meditation practitioners, the brain was on average 7.5 years younger than chronological age, so if we assume in untrained individuals a one-to-one relation between chronological age and brain age, among the long-term meditators, the age of the brain was on average, using these objective parameters of brain structure, 7.5 years younger than what would be predicted from their chronological age. And so, again, we're still in the very early days. This is really the infancy period of this work, but there may be some important implications of that I think will unfold over time. On the sort of non-finding end, one of the things that many people thought we would see very clearly is an increase in interoceptive accuracy. Interoception is the ability to perceive internal bodily signals. And there are ways of objectively measuring this. We published a study a number of years ago with different groups of meditators showing that there was no increase in interoceptive accuracy whatsoever. I mean, not even a hint of an increase. However, if we asked practitioners to rate their confidence that they were doing this accurately, the meditators had high confidence that they were doing this really accurately, and yet objectively in their performance, they're absolutely no different than untrained controls. And so, again, these are just bits and pieces early on, and it's going to take a while before all this congeals in some meaningful way. And I think we're going to need to just be patient with the rate at which progress is being made. But I thank you for the question. It's an important one.
Just to say, I do ask not about brain, things we found out about the brain, but things that have we found out anything new about meditation and Buddhism. Didn't know.
Well, let me mention one thing that may satisfy that question, although it also comes from the brain. One of the things that we are finding, that a number of studies are finding with compassion practices, is that motor or action networks in the brain are activated. And when we have discussed that with long-term meditation practitioners, with meditation masters, that was an interesting observation, because they began to see that compassion practice is a kind of practice that is preparing a person for action. When suffering is encountered, the training really is a training to propel them to act in the face of suffering. And I think that was a novel insight. One other insight is the distinction between compassion and empathy. Many people in the helping professions have talked about compassion burnout, and when long-term meditation practitioners have engaged in practices to generate empathy versus generating compassion, one of the things they report is that generating empathy can really be toxic. When that empathy is for a person who is anxious or fearful or in pain. And so this leads to the intuition that there really may not be such a thing as compassion burnout, and that when we refer to that, it may be, we may think of it as empathy burnout. And finally, let me just end by saying that there are some extremely well-known, very, very long-term practitioners who have told me that one of the things these are monks, one of the things they sometimes reflect on is that when they sit down to practice each day, simply knowing that their practice is changing their brain actually provides some additional motivation and inspiration for them to keep practicing. So thank you.
So we're going to have to close because our two interlocutors are both expected elsewhere. Khenpo is giving a Dharma teaching tonight at 7 o'clock. In fact, he's teaching all weekend. So for anyone interested, you can ask any of us for the details. So he needs to leave. And then Richie literally just flew in and is literally flying out. After this, I have to say that there is such powerful intention that brought this occasion together. It was meant to be a 4-hour closed-door meeting, and then so many people sent inquiries about this conversation, and both Khenpo and Richie have been extraordinarily generous, and even though they wanted to continue the private conversation with each other, they also opened their hearts and decided it's the right time to make this a public conversation as well. Such a leap of faith, and grateful to both Khenpo and to Richie, and to Martha, who has been a backbone for me, a dear friend, to do this. And we're going to visit Martha's clinic, where she does incredible work on autism and brain research as well. So I just want to say that it seems seamless. This conversation between Khenpo and Richie has seemed seamless, but there's a reason for that. And that reason is because there has been actually 30 years, 3 decades of dialogue already, right, between scientists and Buddhism, and Buddhist philosophers and meditators. And this dialogue is what we are building on, and it's the shoulders on which we stand. There are people who've been involved in that dialogue for many years, and a very bright light in the middle of which has been Richie. Other people have been involved, some people in this room to different extents. Professor Janet Gatso has been involved, and Michael Sheehy now is carrying the torch for the future of this kind of engagement, and it's so important. What this occasion, what this event today represents is the search for another frontier, the next frontier. How do we create a thread of connection to talking about these issues inside Tibet and inside China? So I wanted to say that Richie has put it so eloquently, the fact that we need to be able to embrace what it is we do not know, and that there will always be that. And so in addition to what I'll continue to do in terms of identifying the thought leaders who create civic space inside Tibet, this particular conversation about the research on the brain and the mind connection, I think, is very, very special. It is a human adventure we're taking all together, and I really hope that it continues to be productive and fruitful. So thank you very much.